Chapter 20 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 5. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. General McClellan arrived at Fort Monroe on the morning of the 2nd of April, 1862, to begin the campaign against Richmond on the route chosen by himself. According to his own report, he had, the next day, ready to move 58,000 men and 100 guns, besides the division artillery. They were of the flower of the volunteer army, and included also Sykes' brigade of regulars, Hunt's artillery reserve, and several regiments of cavalry. These were all on the spot, prepared to march, and an almost equal number were on their way to join him. He seemed, at first, to appreciate the necessity for prompt and decisive action, and with only 1 day's delay issued his orders for the march up the peninsula between the York and James rivers. The first obstacle that he expected to meet was the force of General J.B. Magruder at Yorktown, which McClellan estimated at from 15,000 to 20,000. Magruder says his force consisted of 11,000, of which 6,000 were required for the fortifications of Yorktown, and only 5,000 were left to hold the line across the peninsula, 13 miles in length. His only object was to delay as long as possible the advance of the national troops upon Richmond, and his dispositions were made to that end. If he had had troops enough, he says that he would have made his line of defense between Ship Point, on the York, and the mouth of the Warwick, on the James. But his force being insufficient for that purpose, he took up as a second line the Warwick River, which heads only a mile or so from Yorktown and empties into the James some 13 miles to the south. Yorktown and its redoubts, united by long curtains and flanked by rifle pits, formed the left of his line, which was continued by the Warwick River, a sluggish and boggy stream running through a dense wood fringed with swamps. The stream was dammed in 2 places, at Wynn's Mill and at Lee's Mill, and Magruder constructed 3 more dams to back up the river and make the fords impassable. Each of these dams was protected by artillery and earthworks. General McClellan was ignorant not only of these preparations made to receive him, but also of the course of the river and the nature of the ground through which it ran. He knew something of the disposition of Magruder's outposts on his first line, and rightly conjectured that they would retire as he advanced. His orders for the 4th of April were therefore punctually carried out, and he seemed to expect no greater difficulty in his plan for the next day. He divided his force into 2 columns, Heintzelman to take the right and march directly to Yorktown, and Keyes, taking the road to the left, to push on to the halfway house in the rear of Yorktown on the Williamsburg Road. He expected Keyes to be there the same day, to occupy the narrow ridge in that neighborhood, to prevent the escape of the garrison at Yorktown by land, and to prevent reinforcements from being thrown in. Heintzelman went forward to the place assigned him in front of Yorktown, meeting with little opposition. Keyes marched by the road assigned him until he came to the enemy's fortified position at Lee's Mill, which, to use General McClellan's words, he found altogether stronger than was expected, unapproachable by reason of the Warwick River, and incapable of being carried by assault. The energetic and active campaign that day begun was at once given up. 2 days of reconnaissances convinced him that he could not break through the line which Magruder's little army of 11,000 men had stretched across the peninsula, and he resolved upon a regular siege of the place. He began at the same time that campaign of complaint and recrimination against the government, which he kept up as long as he remained in the service. He always ascribed the failure of his campaign at this point to 2 causes. First, to the want of assistance by the Navy in reducing Yorktown, and second, to the retention of McDowell's corps in front of Washington. If the Navy had silenced the batteries at Yorktown and Gloucester, he contended, he could have gone up the peninsula unchecked. This is unquestionably true. It would be equally true to say, in general terms, that if somebody else would do our work, we would have no work to do. He brings no proof to show that he had any right to expect that the Navy would do this for him. It is true that he asked before he left Washington that the Navy might cooperate with him in this plan, and received in reply the assurance that the Navy would render him all the assistance in its power. The sworn testimony of Captain Fox, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and Admiral Goldsborough, shows that nothing was promised that was not performed, and that the Navy stood ready to give, and did give, all the assistance to the Army which was possible. Captain Fox said, "Wooden vessels could not have attacked the batteries at Yorktown and Gloucester with any degree of success. The forts at Yorktown were situated too high, were beyond the reach of naval guns, and I understand that General McClellan never expected any attack to be made on them by the Navy." Admiral Goldsborough's evidence is to the same effect. He promised that the Merrimac should never go up the York River, and she did not. He did everything that General McClellan requested of him. His orders from the department were clear and urgent, though general. He was to extend the army, at all times, any and all aid that he could render, and he never refused to honor any draft that was made upon him. The greatest of McClellan's grievances was the retention of McDowell's corps, and his clamor in regard to this was so loud and long as to blind many careless readers and writers to the facts of the case. We have stated them already, but they may be briefly recapitulated here. A council of war of General McClellan's corps commanders, called by himself, had decided that Washington could not be safely left without a covering force of 55,000, including the garrisons of the forts. When he had gone, General Wadsworth reported that he had left only 19,000, and had ordered away nearly half of these. Two eminent generals in the War Department investigated this statement and found it true, whereupon the President ordered that McDowell's corps should for the present remain within reach of Washington. McClellan took with him to the peninsula an aggregate force of over 100,000 men, afterwards largely increased. His own morning report of the 13th of April, signed by himself and his adjutant general, shows that he had with him, actually present for duty, 100,970. With this overwhelming superiority of numbers, he could have detached 30,000 men at any moment to do the work that he had intended McDowell to do. But all the energy he might have employed in this work he diverted in attacking the administration at Washington, which was doing all that it could do to support and provide for his army. The attitude of the President towards him at this time may be seen from the following letter of the 9th of April, in which Mr. Lincoln answers McClellan's complaints with as much consideration and kindness as a father would use towards a querulous and petulant child. Your dispatches complaining that you are not properly sustained, while they do not offend me, do pain me very much. Blenker's division was withdrawn from you before you left here, and you know the pressure under which I did it, and, as I thought, acquiesced in it, certainly not without reluctance. After you left, I ascertained that less than 20,000 unorganized men, without a single field battery, were all you designed to be left for the defense of Washington and Manassas Junction, and part of this even was to go to General Hooker's old position. General Banks's corps, once designed for Manassas Junction, was diverted and tied up on the line of Winchester and Strasburg, and could not leave it without again exposing the Upper Potomac and the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. This presented, or would present when McDowell and Sumner should be gone, a great temptation to the enemy to turn back from the Rappahannock and sack Washington. My explicit order that Washington should, by the judgment of all the commanders of Army Corps, be left entirely secure, had been neglected. It was precisely this that drove me to detain McDowell. I do not forget that I was satisfied with your arrangement to leave Banks at Manassas Junction, But when that arrangement was broken up, and nothing was substituted for it, of course I was constrained to substitute something for it myself. And allow me to ask, do you really think I should permit the line from Richmond via Manassas Junction to this city to be entirely open, except what resistance could be presented by less than 20,000 unorganized troops? This is a question which the country will not allow me to evade. There is a curious mystery about the number of troops now with you. When I telegraphed you on the 6th saying that you had over 100,000 with you, I had just obtained from the Secretary of War a statement taken, as he said, from your own returns, making 108,000 then with you and en route to you. You now say that you have but 85,000, when all en route to you shall have reached you. How can the discrepancy of 23,000 be accounted for? As to General Wool's command, I understand that it is doing for you precisely what a like number of your own would have to do if that command was away. I suppose the whole force which has gone forward for you is with you by this time, and if so, I think that it is the precise time for you to strike a blow. By delay, the enemy will relatively gain upon you. That is, he will gain faster by fortifications and reinforcements than you can by reinforcements alone. And once more, let me tell you, it is indispensable to you that you strike a blow. I am powerless to help this. You will do me the justice to remember I always insisted that going down the bay in search of a field, instead of fighting at or near Manassas, was only shifting and not surmounting a difficulty, that we would find the same enemy and the same or equal entrenchments at either place. The country will not fail to note, is now noting, that the present hesitation to move upon an entrenched enemy is but the story of Manassas repeated. I beg to assure you that I have never written you or spoken to you in greater kindness of feeling than now, nor with a fuller purpose to sustain you, so far as, in my most anxious judgment, I consistently can. But you must act. These considerations produced no impression upon General McClellan. From the beginning to the end of the siege of Yorktown, his dispatches were one incessant cry for men and guns. These the government furnished to the utmost extent possible, but nothing contented him. His hallucination of overwhelming forces opposed to him began again, as violent as it was during the winter. On the 8th of April, he wrote to Admiral Goldsborough, "I am probably weaker than they now are, or soon will be." His distress is sometimes comic in its expression. He writes on the 7th of April, "The Warwick River grows worse the more you look at it." While demanding McDowell's corps en bloc, he asked on the 5th for Franklin's division, and on the 10th repeated this request, saying that although he wanted more, he would be responsible for the results if Franklin's division were sent him. The government, overborne by his importunity, gave orders the same day that Franklin's division should go to him, and the arrangements for transporting it were made with the greatest diligence. He was delighted with this news, and although the weather was good and the roads improving, he did nothing but throw up earthworks until they came. They arrived on the 20th, and no use whatever was made of them. He kept them in the transports in which they had come down the bay more than 2 weeks, in fact, until the day before the siege ended. It is hard to speak with proper moderation of such a disposition of this most valuable force, so clamorously demanded by General McClellan, and so generously sent him by the President. General Webb, the intimate friend and staff officer of McClellan, thus speaks of it. The latter officer, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander of the Corps of Engineers, was then instructed to devise the proper arrangements and superintend the landing of the troops. But, extraordinary as it may seem, more than 2 weeks were consumed in the preliminaries, and when everything was nearly ready for the disembarkation, the enemy had vanished from the scene. How long it would have taken the whole of McDowell's corps to disembark at this rate, the reader may judge. And yet, for days it had been General McClellan's pet project, in connection with his plan of campaign, to utilize McDowell in just this manner as a flanking column. The simple truth is, there was never an hour during General McClellan's command of the army that he had not more troops than he knew what to do with, yet he was always instinctively calling for more. Mr. Stanton one day said of him, with natural hyperbole, "If he had 1,000,000 men, he would swear the enemy had 2,000,000, and then he would sit down in the mud and yell for 3. He repeatedly telegraphed to Washington that he expected to fight an equal or greater force, in fact, all the available force of the rebels, in the neighborhood of Yorktown. We have the concurrent testimony of all the Confederate authorities that no such plan was ever thought of. Magruder's intentions, as well as his orders from Richmond, were merely to delay McClellan's advance as long as practicable. His success in this purpose surpassed his most sanguine expectations. In the early days of April, he was hourly expecting an attack at some point on his thinly defended line of 13 miles, guarded, as he says, by only 5,000 men, exclusive of the 6,000 who garrisoned Yorktown. But to my utter surprise, he continues, he permitted day after day to elapse without an assault. At last, no less to his astonishment than to his delight, Magruder discovered that McClellan was beginning a regular siege, which meant a gain of several weeks for the rebel defense of Richmond, and absolute safety for the concentration of rebel troops in the meantime. It is now perfectly clear that McClellan could have carried out the line of Magruder by assault at any time during the early days of April. From the mass of testimony to this effect before us, we will take only 2 or 3 expressions of the highest authority. General A.S. Webb says that the Warwick line could have been readily broken within a week after the army's arrival before it, we now know. General Heintzelman says, in his evidence before the Committee on the Conduct of the War, "I think if I had been permitted, when I first landed on the peninsula, to advance, I could have isolated the troops in Yorktown, and the place would have been fallen in a few days, but my orders were very stringent not to make any demonstration." General Barnard, McClellan's chief of engineers, says in his final report of the campaign that the lines of Yorktown should have been assaulted. "There is reason to believe that they were not held by strong force when our army appeared before them, and we know that they were far from complete. Our troops toiled a month in the trenches, or lay in the swamps of the Warwick. We lost few men by the siege, but disease took a fearful hold of the army, and toil and hardship, unrelieved by the excitement of combat, impaired the morale. We did not carry with us from Yorktown so good an army as we took there." The testimony of the enemy is the same. Johnston, so soon as he came to examine it, regarded the position of Magruder as clearly untenable, saw that McClellan could not be defeated there, that the line was too long to be successfully defended, that the backwater was as much a protection to one side as the other, that there was a considerable unfortified space between Yorktown and the head of the stream open to attack, and that the position could at any time be turned by way of the York River. Everyone seemed to see it, except General McClellan. He went on sending dispatches every day to Washington for heavier guns and more men, digging a colossal system of earthworks for gradual approach on one side of an entrenched camp of no strategic value whatever, the rear of which was entirely open, preparing with infinite labor and loss the capture of a place without a prisoner, the effect of which, at the best, would be merely to push an army back upon its reserves. Even so, late as the 16th of April, an opportunity to break Magruder's line was clearly presented to McClellan and rejected. He had ordered General W. F. Smith to reconnoiter a position known as Dam No. 1, between Lee's and Wynn's Mills, where there was a crossing covered by a one-gun battery of the enemy. For this purpose, Smith pushed Brooks' Vermont brigade with Mott's battery somewhat close to the dam, carrying on a sharp fire. From this point he examined at his leisure, and in fact controlled, the position opposite, finding it feebly defended. A young officer of Brooks's staff, Lieutenant E.M. Noyes, crossed the river below the dam, where the water was only waist-deep, and approached within 50 yards of the enemy's works. Returning after this daring feat, he repeated his observations to General Smith and to General McClellan, who had arrived on the ground and had ordered Smith to bring up his entire division to hold the advanced position occupied by Brooks's brigade. Smith, who perceived the importance of Noyes's intelligence, obtained permission to send a party across the stream to see if the enemy's works had been sufficiently denuded to enable a column to effect a lodgment. 4 companies of the 3rd Vermont, numbering 200 men, under Captain F.C. Harrington, were ordered to cross the river to ascertain the true state of affairs. They dashed through the stream, and in a few moments gained the enemy's rifle pits, where they maintained themselves with the utmost gallantry for half an hour. The enemy was thrown into great confusion by this bold and utterly unexpected movement. There were still several hours of daylight left, and another attempt was made to cross at the same point with a force no larger than Harrington's, assisted by a diversion of an equal force at the dam above. But the enemy being now thoroughly aroused and concentrated, the crossing was not made. It appears from General Smith's report that no attempt to mass the troops of the division for an assault was made. The only intention seemed to be to secure us the enemy's works if we found them abandoned. He adds, "The moment I found resistance serious and the numbers opposed great, I acted in obedience to the warning instructions of the General-in-Chief, and withdrew the small number of troops exposed from under fire." Thus, says General Webb, a fair opportunity to break the Warwick line was missed. The importance of this incident may be best appreciated by reading General Magruder's account of it. He calls it a serious attempt to break his line at the weakest part. If, instead of 200 men, Smith had felt authorized to push over his entire division, the Peninsular Campaign might have had a very different termination. McClellan announced the movement of General Smith in a somewhat excited dispatch to the War Department, which Mr. Stanton answered with still more enthusiastic congratulations. "Good for the first lick," he shouts. "Hurrah for Smith and the one-gun battery," showing the intense eagerness of the government to find motives for satisfaction and congratulation in McClellan's conduct. But there was no sequel to the movement. Indeed, General McClellan's dispatches indicate considerable complacency that Smith was able to hold the position gained. General Webb says, "Reconnaissances were made, but no assaulting columns were ever organized to take advantage of any opportunity offered." No congratulations or encouragements from the government now availed anything with McClellan. Struggling with a command and a responsibility too heavy for him, he had fallen into a state of mind in which prompt and energetic action was impossible. His double illusion of an overpowering force of the enemy in his front, and of a government at Washington that desired the destruction of his army, was always present with him, paralyzing all his plans and actions. In his private letters, he speaks of Washington as that sink of iniquity, of the people in authority as those treacherous hounds, of the predicament he is in, the rebels on one side and the abolitionists and other scoundrels on the other. "I feel," he says, "that the fate of a nation depends upon me, and I feel that I have not one single friend at the seat of government." This at a moment when the government was straining every nerve to support him. The Confederates, as Mr. Lincoln had said, were daily strengthening their position by fortification and reinforcement. On the 17th of April, General Joseph E. Johnston took command on the peninsula. He says that his force after the arrival of G.W. Smith's and Longstreet's divisions amounted to about 53,000 men, including 3,000 sick. He places the force of McClellan at 133,000, including Franklin's division of 13,000 floating idly on their transports. He did nothing more than to observe the Union army closely, to complete the fortifications between Yorktown and the inundations of the Warwick, and to hold his own forces in readiness for a movement to the rear. He kept himself informed of the progress of McClellan's engineering work against Yorktown, as it was not his intention to remain long enough to spend an hour under fire. He did not expect to be hurried. He had long before that given his opinion that McClellan did not especially value time. Every day of delay was of course an advantage, but an additional day or two gained by enduring a cannonade would have been dearly bought in blood, and he therefore determined to go before McClellan's powerful artillery should open upon him. Seeing, as we now can, what was occurring upon both sides of the Warwick River, there is something humiliating, and not without a touch of the pathetic, in the contrast between the clear vision of Johnston and the blindness of McClellan in relation to each other's attitude and purpose. While the former was simply watching for the flash of the first guns to take his departure, glad of every day that the firing was postponed, but entirely indifferent to the enormous development of the siege works going on in his sight, the latter was toiling with prodigious industry and ability over his vast earthworks and his formidable batteries, only pausing to send importune dispatches to Washington for more guns and more soldiers, forbidding the advance of a picket beyond specified limits, carefully concealing every battery until all should be finished, not allowing a gun to be fired until the whole thunderous chorus should open at once, firmly convinced that when he was entirely ready, he would fight and destroy the whole rebel army. Nearly 100 heavy Parrott guns, mortars, and howitzers were placed in battery against the town and camp of Yorktown and its outlying works, only 1,500 or 2,000 yards away. Against the opinion of his ablest staff officers, McClellan kept this immense armament silent for weeks, while he was continually adding to it. General Barnard, chief of engineers, says, "We should have opened our batteries on the place as fast as they were completed." General Barry, chief of artillery, says, "The ease with which the 100 and 200 pounders of this battery, battery number 1, were worked, the extraordinary accuracy of their fire, and the since ascertained effects produced upon the enemy by it, force upon me the conviction that the fire of guns of similar caliber and power in the other batteries at much shorter ranges, combined with the cross-vertical fire of the 13 and 10-inch seacoast mortars, would have compelled the enemy to surrender or abandon his works in less than 12 hours. General McClellan's only reason for refusing to allow the batteries to open fire as they were successively finished was the fear that they would be silenced by the converging fire of the enemy as soon as they betrayed their position. That this was a gross error is shown by the Confederate reports. They were perfectly cognizant of the progress and disposition of his batteries. The very good reason why they did not annoy him in their construction was that the Union lines were, to use Johnston's words, beyond the range of our old-fashioned ship guns. A few experimental shots were fired upon the shore batteries on the 1st of May. The effect of them convinced the Confederate general of the enormous surplus strength of the Federal artillery. The shots from their first volley fell in the camp of the Confederate reserve, a mile and a half beyond the village. How long General McClellan would have continued this futile labor if he had been left alone, it is impossible to conjecture. If there was, at first, a limit in his own mind to the work to be done and the time to be consumed, it must have been continually moved forward until it passed out of sight. Up to the last moment, he was still making demands which would have taken weeks to fill. The completion of one work was simply an incentive to the beginning of another. Thus, on the 28th of April, a week after Franklin's arrival, At a time when Johnston was already preparing to start for Richmond, he telegraphs to Washington as a pleasant bit of news that he had commenced a new battery from the right of the first parallel, and adds, "Would be glad to have the 30-pounder Parrotts in the works around Washington at once. Am very short of that excellent gun." It is not difficult to imagine how such a dispatch at such a time smote upon the intense anxiety of the President. He answered in wonder and displeasure, "Your call for Parrott guns from Washington alarms me, chiefly because it argues indefinite procrastination. Is anything to be done?" But the general, busy with his trenches and his epaulements, paid no regard to this searching question. 2 days later, May 1st, he continued his cheery report of new batteries and rifle pits, and adds, "Enemy still in force and working hard." And these stereotyped phrases continued with no premonition of any immediate change until on the 4th he telegraphed, "Yorktown is in our possession," and later in the day began to magnify his victory, telling what spoils he had captured, and ending with the sounding phrases, "No time shall be lost. I shall push the enemy to the wall." Johnston had begun his preparation to move on the 27th of April, and on the 3rd of May, finding that McClellan's batteries were now ready to open, a fact apparently not yet known to McClellan, he gave orders for the evacuation, which began at midnight. He marched away from Yorktown with about 50,000 men. General McClellan, by his own morning report of the 30th of April, had in his camps and trenches, and scrambling in haste on board the transports that they had quitted the day before, an aggregate of 112,392 present for duty, the total aggregate present and absent being 130,378. End of chapter 20.